Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. So this work is slightly different than you're going to be seeing in the next few talks. But it's actually looking at the relationships of Ediacaran fronds to each other. So we all pretty much here know about the Ediacaran biota, how it's made up of the largest complex eukaryotes. They are decimeter in scale. They're the first time you actually see this in the fossil record. And they are primarily composed of soft-bodied organisms impressed on various substrates of rock. Now, traditionally, this has been assumed to be the immediate precursor to the Cambrian explosion, with various affinities given to many taxa, some proposed to be true metazoans, some stem metazoans, and some in different constructed scenarios have them either as their own phyla or as members of different other groups, such as fungi or different protists. So the big question with this flowering of life in a very diverse collection from around the world is basically, there, it's a bit of slow on there, how do they relate to each other? And then how do you relate them to modern organisms? So recently, work by Irwin and al. in 2011 and refined by Laflamme in 2013 took the major groups of organisms and put them into 10 different basically morpho groupings. Okay, so these were grouped based on large-scale morphological similarity. And the problem with this, and the authors will themselves admit this, is that these morpho groupings are likely not monophyletic clades. They likely are resulting from convergences in many different forms, and thus, while they are important, they are probably not the first true steps to understanding how everything relates to each other. And this was very powerfully put in a paper form by Budd and Jensen when they said that these features which make these morpho groups and are presented as sort of synapomorphies in some cases could well be homologous, because we don't actually have a good phylogenetic framework to test issues of homology, issues of patterns of evolution, rates of evolution, all these sort of factors that we delve on in great detail in other parts of the fossil record. So this paper actually presented not only a very important criticism, but a very grand opportunity and a way forward to start investigating the actual relationships of these organisms, not just as used to be done in the pre-cladistic days of, say, vertebrate taxonomy with, I think this group sort of looks like this one, but to actually put it in a rigorous phylogenetic framework. So for the work presented here, and this actually was published earlier this year, we focused on the frondose organisms. And frondose organisms are found in three of these morpho groups: the rangiomorphs, the arboriomorphs, and the ornithomorphs. So this is them in all their glory. And originally, when they were first discovered, they were all thought to actually be part of a larger group. In the Treatise of Invertebrate Paleontology in 1979, Glazner called them the Pelanomai. So one large group encompassing all frondose organisms. More recently, work has actually looked at some of the subdivisions, such as the rangiomorph element and the various branching patterns of arboriomorphs here with their pea-pod shape versus the ornithomorphs, and said, well, no, they're actually probably not all one big group. They're separate groups. And so this has brought the idea that, well, maybe there you go. The frondose form is actually a convergence within three different lineages. So we thought, well, let's test this. Do we find you have basically all upright frond things like this and this, it's grouping together with something like that separate out? Or do you find all things that have a rangiomorph element falling together? All things that have this pea-pod shapes falling together? So in order to do this, you have to get an outgroup. And for our analysis, we chose Thaumatillion. And the reason that we chose this is because we are fairly certain that Thaumatillion does not belong to any of the in-group taxa. It's usually thought of as a stem Cnidarian. And so it wouldn't actually be artificially breaking up some of these groups. As well as because it had a similar sort of bow plan to many of the taxa we're looking at here, the characters that we created weren't going to be preferentially scored in one group versus another. And that's actually a problem that I'll get to a bit later about unequal scoring. So when we derived characters, we actually did 22 morphological characters. We based them on pre-existing sort of classification schemes in the literature, like Brazier 2012 and Narbonne and Ale 2009, as well as direct inspection of fossil specimens from all the taxa that we use, the 17 different taxa that we use, with the exception of China discus georgensis. And basically going through all the literature as well for each species that we're looking at. Now, we basically designed characters in sort of 3 different major clusters. You get morphology itself, which is pretty self-explanatory, but when we made characters, we not only made simple, what's called neomorphic, which are present or absence characters, but we also had sort of multi-state characters to more further flesh out differences in the details of this morphology. And so I'll give you sort of an example of it here. So if I was to say take something like this is a rangiomorph taxa and say, well, does it have a rangiomorph element or not? That is not actually making a proper character, because the rangiomorph element is being used to define this group anyway. So I'm basically doing a circular logic. So I took that rangiomorph element and I said, OK, can I break it down into details of its morphology which describe the pattern that we see, but are not sort of circular, because these individual details can be spread across multiple different taxa. So for example, is the main body of the organism basically formed of repeating modular units? Well, yes, it is in this case. But it's also present in what we traditionally classify as ernietomorphs. OK? Then you can say, well, all those repeating units, are they branching or non-branching? Well, in this case, they actually are branching. And then you can say, OK, but the elements that compose the petalodium, are they tubular or non-tubular? In this case, they're not tubular. So the rangiomorph element can be decomposed into, in this case, there's 3 examples of it, multiple different features. And each individual feature can actually be spread out across can have different appearances across different organisms. So we're not just saying it's a rangiomorph element, we're actually breaking it down to the smallest components that we can get. We also looked at previously proposed to be important features such as polarity. And polarity relates to the axis of growth. This was discussed in great detail by Brazier et al. In 2012 and in subsequent work by that group. But the idea is that how the organism grows, the direction it grows, is very important for basically systemics. And then we actually have the type of growth. Does it grow by adding something at the end called insertion? Or does it grow through basically inflating each individual element? And the idea is, that's been proposed in first thing from Enkelf and Brazier and in subsequent work, that if an organism grows by adding new elements, that's a fundamental difference in its development, versus if basically at the smallest individual you have the same number of elements, they just grow through inflation from the smallest to the largest. So taking all these characters, 22 characters, we could actually score them across all 17 taxa. Like I said, I specifically designed characters that were scoreable across all of them, which is why I did things like not include all the different morphoclades in here. Because at this point, if you included morphoclades which we couldn't actually fully score, you would artificially be pulling them apart. You'd artificially be making it like, oh look, they come together, because they're just not scoreable for enough characters. So I ran it in PALP, which is a program which is used for phylogenetics. I actually used 2 different measurements to figure out how supported each of the clades were, both bootstrapping and Bremer support. The characters I made up, I didn't weight them, which means that I didn't artificially say that going from state 0 to 1 is harder than from, say, state 1 to 2. And the trees I'm going to present are strict consensus trees, which are basically the least forgiving ways of presenting a tree. So well, here's the first tree. Like I said, it's out in the paper, but if anyone hasn't seen it, I'll give you a chance to look at it. It doesn't look like much, but trust me, this was a lot of work. We actually see here that the three groups, Arangiomorphs, Erniettomorphs, and Arboromorphs, separate out to form three different clades, which are each of the clades is well supported. We also find some interesting patterns emerging through here. So if you take this here, you see that the Erniettomorphs are sister groups to the Arangiomorphs. Both these clades have a modular development, although there's differences in how the individual sections look, the individual modules. But that suggests modularity is probably a synapomorphy of this group here. We also find that we have a pattern of upright fronds, which you've seen in Arboromorphs, Sphaeropuntia here, and then later within Arangiomorphs, appearing as derived features within this clade here. So the idea that the upright nature is actually a secondary derived character within Arangiomorphs. Now, because outgroups are very important for when you run this to get your data, we ran a second outgroup, what I called an artificial outgroup, which is basically assigning all characters to their most basal state. And using that, we again recover the three clades. They're not as resolved within the Arangiomorphs, but we actually get a flipping of Arboromorphs being closer to the Arangiomorphs. So if this is true, this actually suggests that modularity evolved more than once. So moving forward, basically what we've recovered is that, yes, the idea of this morpho group Rangiomorpha is actually a true phylogenetic clade. So we can stop saying morpho group and say it's a clade. And this clade, which was traditionally sort of thought of as having the Rangiomorph element, has a series of features about it which link them together, despite all the disparity in forms. You have fully upright forms, you have recumbent forms such as that, you have this branching forms like Hespitophilus. But despite all that diversity in body plan, they share a single common ancestor. Arboromorphs also share a single common ancestor, but they do not have as diverse a body plan. And Erniettomorphs look to have a single ancestor, and again show a sort of disparity in body plan, although they're not very large in numbers. So our results show that the frondose pattern, this upright frond that you see here and here, that is a convergent feature that happened within these clades. It happened at least twice, probably more like 3 or 4 times. We also find that in sort of a larger sense, you can actually do phylogenetics in the Ediacaran. You can extract enough data to run and get well-supported trees. There is enough morphological information there. Our results support these morpho groups, so they're real clades, which is not earth-shaking because most people already thought that these were the groupings, but it's nice to actually have them supported and get some synapomorphies for them. And we also find that convergence seems to be quite common within and actually between the clades. So by having now a phylogenetic framework, you can investigate these types of convergence. So for example, if we're looking at growth, and I talked to you about that inflationary versus insertionary growth, it looks like within, say, the Rangiomorphs, which are the ones which are the most speciose that we have up here, that insertionary growth happened at least twice. It's not a uniting feature. It happened a couple of times within the clade. Now that's important because if it truly represents a major developmental reorganization, it means that their system was plastic enough that they could go back and forth. There's also implications for modularity. If using the Thaumatilion outgroup is the correct reconstruction, then modularity probably originated once at the base of the clade which encompasses Erniettomorphs and Arangiomorphs. If it's the true topology is closer to what you see with the artificial outgroup, then there's a potential for modularity to have evolved independently within at least 2 groups. And again, as I said, having a phylogenetic tree, a framework, we can start to test concepts of homology across them, as well as environmental drivers of certain body forms in different groups. So the basic take-home is that the Ediacaran biota can now be brought into the age of cladistics. And this work is the beginnings of sort of extending that throughout the whole biota. So I'd like to thank everybody, and I think I have time for questions.